In the frozen winter of 1858, deep in the smoky heart of Jefferson County, Alabama, an act of violence shattered the rhythm of industry and left a stain that Birmingham's furnaces would carry for generations. His name was Brutus Caldwell, an enslaved man known for his quiet endurance, a man who had borne 13 years of bondage without a single act of defiance. And yet, one night, in the choking heat of the Sloth Iron Works, he lifted a 20-pound sledgehammer and brought it down with such merciless force that his master's skull burst apart like a melon falling from a church steeple. The sound did not vanish in the roar of the furnaces it cut through it. A hollow crack that rang like a funeral bell, a noise so sharp and sickening that 17 men who stood nearby would later swear they could still hear it in their dreams. The splintering of bone echoed longer than any hammer strike, longer than any scream. When the authorities came to investigate, they thought they were handling a single crime. But what they uncovered was not just murder, it was evidence of something far darker. A conspiracy that coiled itself through Alabama's rising empire of iron and smoke. A network of secrets so carefully hidden that the city's most powerful men would spend decades burying the truth beneath molten metal and forged silence. The horror you see was not only in the death of one man. It lay in what had driven Brutus Caldwell, a man never known. For violence to unleash such savage strength that witnesses claimed they heard bones shatter from 50 yards away, even over the thunder of the blast furnaces. His master's blood spilled onto the searing floor so quickly that it hissed and steamed, curling upward in white vapor that some described as sounding like serpents dying in fire. Before we follow the trail of Brutus Caldwell, before we unearth what he discovered and why it made his hammer fall, I need to ask you something. If you're new here, take a moment to subscribe and ring the notification bell, because stories like this one, they don't fade away by accident. They are buried deliberately by men with power, with wealth, and with everything to lose if the truth ever reached daylight. And I'd like to know, where are you listening from tonight? Drop your city or state in the comments. Because what happened here in Birmingham was not unique. It could have taken root in any corner of America where men gambled with human lives and built fortunes out of coal, iron, and flesh. To understand the hammer's fall, we must first understand the world Brutus Caldwell lived in. His story does not begin with blood, but with Birmingham itself. Or rather, with the land before the city bore that name. Birmingham wouldn't be officially founded until 1871. In 1858, it was still a scattered landscape of mining camps and ironworks strung across the mineral-rich valleys of Jefferson County, long before these valleys had belonged to the Cherokee. Their burial grounds still dotted the hillsides, silent markers of prayers whispered centuries before. But by the 1850s, settlers had uncovered a treasure more valuable than farmland, a geological trinity that made this ground unlike almost any other in the world. Iron ore that could be dug almost with bare hands. Coal seams so vast, they seemed endless. And limestone rising in cliffs like ancient cathedrals, the perfect ingredient for smelting. It was as if the land itself had been designed for industry, offering the raw bones of a fortune for any man ruthless enough to claim it. One such man was Cornelius Sloth, barely 5.5 feet tall, prematurely grey, with eyes as pale and unblinking as winter ice sloth, embodied both ambition and cruelty in equal measure. Unlike the planters of Alabama's cotton belt, men content to wring wealth from soil and slaves, Sloth looked at the furnaces and saw the future. He understood that cotton could burn insects, could devour fields, weather could destroy harvests. But iron was eternal. Iron built bridges, railroads, and cities. Iron was progress made solid. Sloth had arrived in Alabama in 1847, a stranger from Pennsylvania with letters of introduction tucked into his coat and a head brimming with ideas borrowed from northern industry. Where others saw a South too proud and too rural for manufacturing, Sloth saw a blank canvas, waiting for fire and steel. The one obstacle, the lack of skilled labor, was no obstacle at all, not in Alabama. For here he found a resource more plentiful than coal, more expendable than ore-enslaved human beings. Bodies that could be driven until they broke, then replaced without consequence. And so the Sloth foundries roared day and night. Fed by rivers of sweat and blood, they turned human endurance into the bones of America's industrial age. Men were shoveled into the furnaces alongside coal. Their lives measured only in how many hours of labor could be extracted before the flames claimed them. The Sloth Iron Works, founded in 1855, rose quickly from the valley floor like a cathedral of smoke and fire. Within just a few years, it became the largest industrial operation in Jefferson County, a place where over 300 enslaved men and women were consumed by labor so relentless that plantation fieldwork seemed by comparison almost merciful. Here the furnaces burned at more than 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, turning the foundry floor into a landscape that matched the Bible's darkest visions of hell. Iron hissed and roared. Sparks flew like unholy fireflies. The very air thickened with smoke and metal dust, until each breath became an act of will, each inhale carrying death deeper into the lungs. For those forced to work the fires, survival was not measured in years, but in days shaved away by every breath. Mortality was 3 times higher here than on the cotton fields. But Cornelius Sloth, the empire's architect, counted death as nothing more than a cost of doing business. Slaves could be replaced, or could not. It was a cold equation written in ledgers, a body bought cheap in Virginia, or the Carolinas, worked until it collapsed, then replaced by another. Human beings were reduced to numbers, to units of production, measured in pennies per pound of iron. Brutus Caldwell arrived at this living inferno in the spring of 1855. He had been sold from the estate of a collapsing Virginia tobacco plantation for the considerable sum of $1,200. His seller, a ruined gambler named Harrison Kendall, had praised him with chilling pride, "The finest piece of property I ever owned. Strong as an ox, smart enough to follow orders, not smart enough to cause trouble." At 28 years old, Brutus was a giant in his age, 6 feet 3 inches tall, when most men barely reached 5.5. His shoulders seemed carved for burden, his arms hardened by years of timber and axe, his hands so immense that a sledgehammer handle fit his grip as naturally as a fork might in another man's hand. His skin bore the copper glow of years in the sun, crisscrossed with the whip's memory across his back, seared by burn scars on his arms, thickened by calluses so dense they seemed like armor. But what people remembered most were his eyes, dark, watchful, intelligent. They carried an unspoken promise, as though every lash, every cruelty was being carefully noted in some invisible ledger debts to be settled when the moment finally came due. Unlike others who had been broken into invisibility, Brutus carried himself with a quiet dignity that even white men noticed. He spoke rarely, but when he did, his words were deliberate, weighted, and final. The work he was given at the Sloth Iron Works was not merely brutal. It was designed to strip men down to their breaking point. 16 hours a day in heat that reached 120 degrees woven away from the furnaces. Enslaved workers shoveled coal into fires that glowed like gateways to hell. They hauled ore in wheelbarrows so heavy a single slip could crush a man. They stood among machines that could grind bone to dust if attention faltered for an instant. Brutus was assigned to the sledge gang, the men who shattered the raw ore into pieces small enough for the furnace. Their weapon was the 20-pound hammer, each one forged with cruel perfection, its balance designed to deliver maximum destruction. For most men, 6 hours of this punishment was the limit. Exhaustion made the hammer too heavy to lift. A rare few could push 8. Brutus Caldwell worked 10, sometimes more. His hammer rose and fell with mechanical precision, never wavering, never slowing, each strike ringing out like a drumbeat that anchored the chaos of the foundry. His rhythm became the lifeline for others, a steady pulse in the smoke and noise. Men synchronized their movements to it, taking comfort in its constancy. Boom crack, boom crack, boom crack. The sound of Brutus's hammer was more than labor. It was the heartbeat of hell itself, steady, unyielding and waiting. The sound of Brutus Caldwell's hammer echoed through the foundry like a funeral drum. Each strike a reminder that time was running out, counting down the days until death or freedom would claim them all. What no one around him knew was that every blow of that sledgehammer was not only for iron, it was practice, silent rehearsal for something else entirely. Because Brutus Caldwell was preparing to turn his hammer into an instrument of judgment, one that would shake the very foundations of Birmingham's iron empire. The first hints of this plan did not come from Brutus himself. They came from the men who labored beside him, slaves whose very survival depended on noticing the smallest shifts in mood or behavior. And in the weeks leading up to December 15th, 1858, they noticed changes that unsettled them deeply. Brutus had always been predictable. He worked, he ate, he slept. He spoke only when spoken to, and his routine never wavered. But then he began to ask questions, odd probing questions that carried a weight no one missed. He wanted to know when certain overseers were stationed on the floor and which corners of the foundry saw the least white supervision. He asked about escape routes through the yards, about where fences were weakest, about how often patrols were changed. These were not idle curiosities. They were the questions of a soldier gathering intelligence. Even more disturbing were the visitors. The slave quarters offered no privacy. Every word could be overheard, every movement spied upon by men eager to curry favor with their masters. And yet, Brutus somehow arranged clandestine meetings. Figures were glimpsed only as shadows in the pre-dawn hours slipping from the trees at the edge of the compound. They used signals no one else could interpret, left behind items that had no place in a slave's possession. Sheets of paper covered in writing which Brutus studied by candlelight before burning to ash. Small, cloth-wrapped packages that clinked when moved. Once, a leather pouch that seemed to jingle with coins. These were signs of connections to a world beyond the fences of Sloth's empire, resources and allies that ordinary slaves could not imagine having. Samuel Hutchins, a fellow worker stationed beside Brutus, would later testify that he once caught sight of a small notebook in his friend's hands. Inside, written in a handwriting so small it looked like ant trails across the page, were columns of names and numbers. When Samuel asked what he was writing, Brutus only replied, "A man needs to keep track of things. You never know when records might come in handy." The notebook vanished after the murder, but Samuel never forgot what he saw. December 15th, 1858 dawned, cold and grey. A storm rolled down from the north, coating the ground in ice and turning the foundry into a treacherous battlefield. Outside, the air bit like knives. Inside, the furnaces roared hotter than ever, flames devouring coal to meet a rush order for railroad iron, promised before Christmas. The contrast between the frozen air and the infernal heat created an atmosphere so volatile that even the walls seemed ready to burst. Ice crusted the windows, while molten fire boiled at the core. This was a place where accidents were expected, not rare. Men slipped on icy walkways and fell screaming into molten metal. Others collapsed from exhaustion and were trampled by their fellow workers who could not afford to break rhythm to save a life. On that day, human beings were valued less than the iron they produced. At precisely 3:17 in the afternoon, Cornelius Sloth made his daily inspection tour, a ritual as cruel as it was deliberate. Sloth never missed it. He moved through the foundry floor like a monarch through his kingdom, gauging production, searching for faults, ensuring every man remembered who held power over his life and death. He dressed not like an industrialist, but like a general reviewing troops' silk shirt imported from France, fine wool trousers cut in New Orleans, boots of polished leather that shone even in the dim smoky light. In his hand, he carried a polished hickory walking stick never used for walking, but often for striking. Workers froze at his presence, aware that his visits often ended with punishment. Sloth had an uncanny talent for finding fault, for dragging out old grudges, for reminding men of debts they could never pay. But this time, he was not alone. 2 men accompanied him, strangers who looked wildly out of place amid the soot and ash. They were well dressed, their clothes untouched by the filth of industry. Each carried a leather portfolio, the kind used by bankers or lawyers. They did not belong to the furnaces. They belonged to the world outside the world of money contracts and secret dealings. And on that winter afternoon, their presence would prove far more dangerous than the flames. The workers noticed the strangers in their fine clothes and whispered among themselves. Were they buyers, inspectors from the government, or something worse, men from the banks who might own even the masters? One day no one knew, but their presence only sharpened the tension, already thick as the furnace smoke. What happened next was seen by 17 different witnesses. Their stories collected later conflicted so wildly that investigators struggled for months to reconstruct a single truth. But on one point, they all agreed. Cornelius Sloth stood near furnace number 3, lashing Samuel Hutchins with words sharper than any whip for moving too slowly. And then Brutus Caldwell moved. All day long, his hammer had struck with the same mechanical rhythm that had become the pulse of the foundry. Boom, crack, boom, crack. At precisely 3:15, that rhythm stopped. Brutus set down the oar he was breaking, lifted his 20-pound sledgehammer, and began to walk. Witnesses swore later that his steps were so steady, so deliberate, that every man watching knew, without knowing, how that something terrible was about to happen. Yet, they stood frozen, trapped by disbelief, as if the very awe had hardened around them. Mr. Sloth Brutus called out his deep voice, carrying cleanly over the roar of fire and iron. His tone was respectful, almost deferential, like a servant announcing himself. "I got something for you, sir." Sloth turned, and what the witnesses saw in his eyes was something they had never seen before. Not surprise, not anger, but fear. Deep primal fear, the kind that shudders up from the marrow when a man realizes death has chosen him. His face drained white. The polished hickory stick shook in his grip. For a moment, Cornelius Sloth, master of men and furnaces, was reduced to a trembling animal. "What do you want?" he demanded. But the words broke in his throat, cracking like a boy's unsteady voice. Brutus raised the sledgehammer. The furnace light caught the steel, and for an instant, the weapon seemed to glow red as though it were forged from hellfire itself. Brutus loomed taller in that glow. His frame magnified his shadow, stretching across the smoke and stone. And then, in a voice that was calm, steady, inexorable, he spoke a single word: justice. The hammer fell. The sound was not like any sound. The human ear was meant to hear a wet explosive crack that burst through the foundry, followed by the thud of Cornelius Sloth's body crumpling to the floor. Brutus did not stop. He raised the hammer again, and again, and again. Each blow was accompanied by the crunch of splintering bone, the spray of blood, the hiss of tissue spattering against white-hot iron. By the fourth strike, there was nothing left of Cornelius Sloth's face, only ruin, a steaming mass seeping into the cracks of the floor. The smell rose, sickly, sweet, human fat, searing on furnace heat. Men gagged, some vomited. None moved. When it was done, Brutus placed the hammer gently on the ground. He looked up at the ring of horrified faces, and with the same calm, measured voice he had always used when speaking to white men said, "Somebody best send for the sheriff. I'll be waiting right here." The shock of Cornelius Sloth's murder reverberated through Alabama like a cannon shot. Word reached Montgomery within hours. This was no ordinary act of defiance, no half-mad slave rebellion to be snuffed out in blood. This was different, calculated, deliberate, terrifying. For the first time, the planter aristocracy stared into the possibility that their entire world might crack beneath the weight of its own brutality. By nightfall, Jefferson County Sheriff Thomas Whitfield rode into the ironworks with 12 armed men. They came expecting chaos fires, corpses perhaps, an uprising spilling into the countryside. Instead, they found something far worse. Perfect order. The foundry continued to roar furnaces, blazing hammers, ringing as though nothing had disturbed the brutal rhythm of industry. The only sign of rupture was the dark stain on the floor, beside furnace number 3. 3 hours had passed since Cornelius Sloth's skull was shattered, yet production had not faltered for a second. Brutus Caldwell sat quietly on a wooden crate, hands folded in his lap posture, serene. He had washed the blood from his skin with oily rags, and his face wore the strange peace of a man who had laid down a lifelong burden. When Sheriff Thomas Whitfield arrived with 12 armed men, rifles primed and shackles ready, Brutus rose without protest. "I killed Cornelius Sloth," he said in a steady voice. "I did it deliberate. I'd do it again if I had to. I got no regrets." The sheriff, hardened by 15 years of crushing uprisings, asked him the only question that mattered: why? Brutus's reply chilled even the deputies who had seen lynchings, burnings, and wars of reprisal. "Ask his ledgers, sheriff. Ask what he wrote in his private books. Ask what he did to the ones who came before me. Ask why 43 souls went away from here and never came back." The other slaves kept working their faces blank as if carved from iron. Questioned individually, they claimed ignorance. No one had seen the books. No one had heard of the missing. To outsiders, it seemed as though Brutus had acted alone, a sudden storm, inexplicable and unrepeatable. But Whitfield wasn't convinced. He had seen rebellion, wild, emotional, chaotic. This was different. Brutus Caldwell stood like a soldier after completing a mission. Calm, measured, planned. The search of Cornelius Sloth's private office confirmed his words. Behind locked drawers and false panels, Whitfield's men uncovered ledgers and correspondence that turned even hardened stomachs. The documents were not the casual cruelties of a typical plantation master. They were meticulous records, experiments, written with the precision of a scientist and the coldness of an accountant. How long a man could swing a hammer without food before collapse. How much body weight a woman could lose before productivity failed. Charts comparing whippings to solitary confinement, starvation to sleep deprivation. Calculations of whether breaking a child in front of its parents yielded greater obedience than cutting rations. Human agony reduced to arithmetic. But the worst discovery lay in letters bearing the seal of Cornelius Sloth himself. Correspondence with Dr. Josiah Knott of Mobile, the notorious physician of racial science. In elegant hand, Sloth described specimens delivered alive for medical study, shipped in modified rail cars, bodies purchased like cattle for dissection and experimentation. Not paid handsomely. Sloth supplied willingly. It was not slavery as the South pretended to justify it, a paternalistic institution cloaked in biblical verses and rhetoric of civilization. This was something else entirely. Industrialized human experimentation, a factory of flesh, a commerce in suffering, and in killing Cornelius Sloth, Brutus. Caldwell had not simply murdered a master. He had torn the veil from a secret powerful men would kill to keep buried. The correspondence revealed a trade in human lives that had persisted for more than 3 years. Cornelius Sloth had not merely been a cruel master, he had been a supplier. His cargo was flesh, his client a man of science. Together, they formed a pipeline of suffering that stretched from the furnaces of Jefferson County to the laboratories of Mobile. The letters from Dr. Josiah Knott were clinical in tone, discussing men, women, and children as though they were livestock or lab rats. Specimens were categorized by age, build, and health. Some were destined for surgical procedures conducted without anesthesia. Others were marked for deliberate infection, syphilis, yellow fever, tuberculosis, their decline to be recorded in detail until death provided the final data point. Payments ranged from $200 to as much as $500 per subject. None ever returned. Knott described his work as terminal studies. Human beings reduced to disposable instruments in his quest to prove racial inferiority. Individually worthless, collectively useful. Sheriff Whitfield sat in Sloth's office, surrounded by ledgers that smelled of ink and iron dust, realizing he was holding proof of systematic murder disguised as science. But he also knew something darker. Josiah Knott was no backroom butcher. He was a celebrated physician, his theories cited in legislatures, his books taught in universities, his research funded by the most respected institutions of the South. His words shaped the laws that kept millions enslaved. To expose him would not simply ruin reputations. It would undermine the intellectual scaffolding of slavery itself. Whitfield made his choice. The ledgers were seized. The deputies told nothing of what they truly contained. Official reports described a simple murder, born of workplace anger, a rogue slave striking down his master. The truth was burned in the furnace, or so it seemed, but Whitfield could not erase everything. In the quiet hours of that night, he copied the most damning documents and sealed them in a tin box. He buried it beneath the floorboards of his home, telling himself he was saving the evidence for a future reckoning, a day when the South might face its sins without tearing itself apart. Perhaps that was true. Perhaps it was only guilt. He could not destroy the only testimony those 43 vanished souls had left behind. When the trial of Brutus Caldwell opened on January 18, 1859, the Jefferson County Courthouse stood like a stage dressed in brick and white columns, a temple of justice meant to reassure the public. Under Alabama law, the verdict was inevitable. A slave who killed his master would hang. No circumstance, no motive, no plea could change that. Trials were theater, not justice. But this trial would not follow the script, because fate or irony had appointed Benjamin Carver as Brutus Caldwell's defense. Young, Harvard-educated, recently returned to Alabama with a head full of northern ideas about law and ethics. He had come south to bring honor to his profession. Instead, he would be asked to defend a man already condemned. And in doing so, he would uncover a truth powerful men would do anything to keep buried. Benjamin Carver was not supposed to matter. He was supposed to stand nod, politely recite a few perfunctory lines of defense, and then step aside while the machinery of Alabama justice ground forward to its inevitable conclusion. But Carver was not made for silence. The son of a preacher raised on scripture that spoke of the equal worth of every soul he had carried that belief with him. From the pews of a small-town church to the lecture halls of Harvard Law, Boston had given him words: abolition, constitutional liberty, natural rights, ideas that burned brightly in his mind even as they dimmed against the realities of his homeland. Alabama taught him compromise, taught him to keep his head down, taught him that the law was less about truth than it was about order. Yet, something in this case broke through that armor of resignation. Unlike the lawyers before him, Carver did not meet his client minutes before trial. He went to the Jefferson County Jail again and again, sitting across from Brutus Caldwell in the dim light of solitary confinement, listening. At first he thought he was hearing the defense of a desperate man, but then came the journal. A crude coat, threadbare at the seams, had carried a secret stitched into its very lining. Inside, folded scraps of paper, lines written in a precise, disciplined hand, a record not of ledgers or profits, but of suffering, Names of the disappeared, dates of the shipments, descriptions of men and women dragged into rail cars that reeked of ether and iron. Testimonies whispered in the dark, preserved by Brutus as if he knew that someday the truth would need a witness. And then came the revelation that froze Carver's blood. Brutus's own name appeared on the December list. He had been marked for shipment. His killing of Cornelius Sloth had not been an act of blind rage, but a strike of survival, a man refusing to walk willingly into the jaws of death, choosing instead to drag his captor down with him. I wasn't murdering my master. Mr. Carver Brutus said, his voice calm, his eyes unyielding. I was fighting for my life, for all of our lives. Sloth was feeding us to that doctor one by one, like a farmer feeding chickens to a fox. If I went quietly, no one would remain to warn the others. No one would tell the truth. Carver sat in silence, the journal heavy in his hands. He realized he now possessed something far more dangerous than evidence. He held a story capable of cracking the very foundations of the South. To use it could mean precedent, the first time a slave might argue self-defense against a master. To use it could mean exposure, dragging Dr. Josiah Nott's empire of racial science into the light of day. But to use it would also mean ruin. His career, his safety, perhaps even his life. And worse, it could unleash retribution so fierce that the slaves of Jefferson County would suffer tenfold. In the days before the trial, Carver wrestled not only with the law, but with his conscience. Was justice the blindfolded woman carved above the courthouse door? Or was justice what a man dared to risk in the face of certain destruction? When the trial of Brutus Caldwell opened, no one yet understood that two men were truly on trial. One sat in chains accused of murder. The other stood in a suite accused silently by the weight of his own conscience of deciding whether truth itself would be given voice or buried beneath Alabama clay forever. Dr. Josiah Nott entered the witness box like a man accustomed to ruling every room he stepped into. His silver hair gleamed beneath the courthouse lamps, his black suit pressed sharp as a blade, his gold watch chain glinting like a medal of honor. He carried himself not as a witness, but as a master lecturer who expected his audience to hang on every word. At first, the courtroom played along. Under the prosecutor's questions, Nott painted Cornelius Sloth as a model industrialist, a man progressive in his treatment of slaves, diligent in maintaining their health, visionary in his consultations with medical experts. It was a portrait calculated to soothe the jury and reaffirm the righteous order of Southern society. But then, Benjamin Carver rose. His tone was polite, even deferential. The young lawyer's drawl carried no hint of hostility, only curiosity. Doctor, you've told us that Mr. Sloth consulted you on the care of his slaves. Could you describe in more specific terms the nature of these consultations? Nott smiled, mistaking the question for flattery. His vanity, sharpened by years of applause in lecture halls, made him blind to the trap before him. He began to elaborate, speaking in the clinical cadences of science. He explained how his research advanced medical understanding, how his studies illuminated racial physiology, how his work had already filled the pages of respected journals. Carver nodded, encouraging him with gentle prompts. Each question was another thread, and the doctor, too arrogant to notice, pulled it tighter around his own throat. Can you tell the court more about these procedures you mentioned? Carver asked mildly. What specific techniques did you develop The doctor's eyes gleamed as he warmed to his subject. He spoke of surgeries conducted without anesthesia, of deliberate infections introduced to track disease progression, of amputations used to measure racial thresholds of pain. He described his methods with the detachment of a butcher explaining the sharpness of his knives, believing that the technical language insulated him from horror. But in the hushed silence of the courtroom, the words did not sound like science. They sounded like cruelty given form. Every juror shifted uneasily. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Even the judge, who had sat impassive through countless trials of slaves and masters alike, leaned forward as if to catch every word. Carver let the silence hang after each answer, giving the room time to absorb the weight of what they had heard. By the time Knott finished his account, the mask of progress and respectability had slipped entirely. What stood exposed was not a healer of men, but a man who had turned human suffering into a laboratory, who had clothed torture in the language of science. And Benjamin Carver, without once raising his voice or offering an accusation, had let the doctor damn himself with his own pride. The word specimen cracked through the courtroom like a pistol shot. For a moment, no one breathed. Even in a society where slavery was accepted, everyone in that chamber understood instinctively that a line had been crossed. To speak of men and women as if they were laboratory rats delivered in prime condition for dissection was something even the most hardened juror could barely stomach. By every measure of reason, that testimony should have ended the trial. It should have been enough to save Brutus. But the machinery of power in Alabama was not designed to yield to truth. Within hours, Benjamin Carver found himself summoned to Judge Crawford's chambers. Waiting there were not only the prosecutor, but two men in tailored suits whose polished shoes spoke of wealth and influence. They introduced themselves as representatives of the Montgomery Railroad Company and the Alabama Medical Society. The judge's words were measured, but merciless. Son, you've made your point. But if you continue down this path, you'll bring down institutions this state depends on. Dr. Knott's work serves a greater purpose. The railroad contracts alone could shape the future of Alabama. Let it end here. The meaning was plain. Brutus would hang no matter the evidence. And if Carver pressed further, he would not only destroy himself, but unleash a backlash that could scorch everything around him. That night, the warning became reality. Carver's office was broken into. Books toppled to the floor, drawers left hanging open, his safe forced apart. And the most precious piece of evidence, Brutus's hidden journal, was gone. But fate, or perhaps luck, left behind a thread. The thieves had overlooked transcripts tucked in plain sight, pressed behind the glass of Carver's Harvard diploma. Enough remained to keep the fire alive. So it was that on January 25th, 1859, Carver stood before a packed courthouse. Word had spread like wildfire through Birmingham. Men crowded the aisles. Women leaned in from the balcony. Tobacco smoke hung heavy in the air, but nothing could dull the sharp expectation thrumming through the crowd. The young lawyer did not begin with case law. He did not cite precedent. Instead, he posed a question. Gentlemen of the jury, imagine your brother, your father, your son, sold to a man who fed 43 souls to a doctor's knife. Imagine your loved one next on the list, 5 days from a fate too monstrous to name. Tell me, what would you do?" The prosecutor leapt up in outrage. The judge barked an objection, but the words were already loose, echoing in the minds of every man on that jury. When does murder become self-defense? And when does a human being gain the right to fight back against a world that denies he is human at all? Piece by piece, Carver rebuilt the case. He called railroad workers who had noticed chains and restraints in boxcars that were never meant for freight, clerks who had stamped permits for medical shipments without daring to ask what lay inside, and finally, assistants of Dr. Knott himself, men who had walked away from pay and prestige rather than take part in horrors they could not explain to their own children. Each voice added a stone to the crumbling wall of lies until even Alabama's most untouchable names began to look stained with blood. What emerged from Benjamin Carver's careful questioning was not the portrait of a single cruel master, but the revelation of an entire machine, a network of corruption that stretched from the furnaces of Birmingham to the lecture halls of Mobile and into the offices of Montgomery's lawmakers. Cornelius Sloth had not been a lone monster. He was a cog in a much larger design, a systematic program that clothed itself in the language of science, shielded itself with the law of property, and fed itself with human lives. Each new witness pulled another brick from the wall of silence. The spectators shifted uneasily in their seats. They had come expecting drama, perhaps even scandal. Instead, they found themselves face to face with atrocities that gnawed at the foundations of their society and forced them to ask whether they too had been complicit. The breaking point came when Carver once again summoned Dr. Josiah Knott. The physician entered the witness stand with visible strain. His hands trembled faintly as he adjusted his spectacles, his earlier arrogance replaced by a defensive stiffness. "Dr. Knott Carver," said his voice, now carrying not the tone of a defense attorney, but the steel of prosecutor. "Do you deny amputating limbs from living subjects without anesthesia?" "I was conducting legitimate medical research," Knott stammered. These procedures advanced. "Do you deny infecting children deliberately just to record their suffering?" The protocols were approved. "And do you deny performing surgery on pregnant women, cutting them open to watch what happened to their unborn children?" Each question landed like a hammer blow. Each faltering answer chipped away at the fragile shell of credibility the doctor still possessed. By the time Carver lowered his voice, the silence in the courtroom was suffocating. Even those who had once praised Knott's medical genius could not unhear what he had confessed in his own words. But the final dagger came not from Carver and not from the doctor. It came from an unexpected source. Martha Sloth, the widow. She was pale, almost fragile. A woman in her 40s, still reeling from her husband's death. The prosecution had called her to speak of Cornelius as a respectable man, a good master. Instead, her testimony tore away the last veil. He changed. She whispered, her eyes fixed on the floor. In those final months, he woke screaming at night. He said he heard sounds, the sounds of people, when they realized what was about to happen to them. Begging, crying, praying. He couldn't silence them. Tears streaked her face. Jurors shifted uncomfortably, glancing down as if ashamed. Carver asked gently, "Did your husband ever speak of regrets?" Martha nodded. He kept a pistol by the bed. He said he feared They would come for him, the ones he had sent away. He barely slept. He wrote letters he never mailed. He said he needed to escape before it destroyed us both. And then, the revelation no one had anticipated. He told me days before he died about a safe hidden behind a false wall in the basement. He said if anything happened, I should tell the authorities. He said there were things inside that needed to come to light. By order of Judge Crawford, Sheriff Whitfield brought the safe's contents into the court. A worn leather satchel was laid upon the defense table, its weight seeming heavier than the parchment it carried. Inside were ledgers, manifests, letters, the bones of a conspiracy made flesh, payments totaling over $20,000 from Dr. Knott, shipping documents listing specimens transported from Birmingham to Mobile, correspondence with government officials who had smoothed the passage of human cargo with their signatures and seals, and at the heart of it all, a single letter, penned in Cornelius Sloth's own hand, dated December 10th, 1858. 5 days before Brutus Caldwell raised his sledgehammer, Dr. William Knott was never brought to justice. But his downfall was a grim testament to the harsher punishments that could be meted out to him. As he trudged through the small markets peddling his blood-dyeing potion, no one called him doctor anymore. He was seen as a soulless man carrying the curse of those he had tormented. And as for Brutus, after his hanging, the name seemed destined to disappear. But in the steel mills of Nashville, workers still whispered of a giant figure appearing when the smoke rose thickly. It was said that one night, in the middle of their shifts, they heard the pounding of a hammer deep slow, reverberating in the chest. No tools could be found, but the hammering continued like the beating heart of someone who refused to be buried. The inmates at Davison Prison told another story that Brutus, in his final days, taught them how to read and write. He turned the bars into desks and the ashes of the dungeon into pages. For them, Brutus did not die on the rope. He lived on in the trembling letters of people who yearned to be human. And then, in 1987, when his writings were unearthed from the rusty tin box, a heavy silence fell over the study. The notes were not like a confession nor a will. They were like a door. What opened was not just the story of an individual, but the memory of an entire city, an entire country. Memories that generations had tried to cover up but could not erase. Today, as we sit here recounting this hidden fragment, the question remains: was Brutus really just a man, or has he become part of a collective memory, forever beating to the haunting sound of the hammers in the heart of Nashville? And most importantly, if history can bury such a voice for over a century, can we be sure that today, right now, another Brutus is not hidden from our eyes?